Okay, thanks, Chris. And hi, everyone. Thanks for coming along. Let's start with an overview of this session. I'll say a few words about the context that we are operating in here at Edinburgh, and then I'll give a brief description of the process that we use to produce clear instructions about how to students about how to submit their exam scripts online. Then I'll hand over to George, who'll take you through the marking process that we used, and he'll compare 3 different tools that we used, and he'll end with some thoughts about how what we're planning to do in the next academic year. Okay, on to the context. Our university decided to cancel all exams for 1st and 2nd years and to keep exams for everyone else. So for us, that meant running online exams for 3rd, 4th and 5th year undergraduates, as well as taught postgraduate students. These were to be take-home open book exams to be done in a fixed time window. The time allowed for exams was as normal, but with an additional 1 hour allowed for preparing and uploading PDF submissions. And in addition, and crucially, there was a no detriment policy in place that meant, in essence, that a student's mark in an individual exam could not decrease their overall average. A key part of this whole process was ensuring that the exam scripts we received from students were in the format that we wanted. As George will mention later, our VLE is Blackboard, which doesn't allow a great deal of control over what students are allowed to submit. So it was very important for us to provide clear instructions to students about how to produce their PDF submission. We drafted step-by-step instructions for students and how to create and submit their PDF exam script. And these were trialed by colleagues before we ran a dummy exam process for all students. Doing this really enabled students to get confidence that they were doing the right thing before they took exams for real. And it enabled us to give feedback to students against a clear set of criteria. The guidance that we ended up producing for students and the set of criteria that we gave them feedback on their dummy exam submission are available in the Moodle site for this conference. So you can download and look at that guidance that we produced, and you can see the feedback that we gave to students. We were very fortunate to have help of postgraduate tutors to be able to provide that feedback to students and really give them the confidence that what they were going to do for real in exams was going to be the right thing. As I said, you can download that guidance that we did produce. This is the sort of thing that we were producing, very visual guidance for students and very clear instructions about what we were expecting of them. Once it came to the exams for real, because we were limited to having to use Blackboard, the only way we could allow students to undo any errors that they made when they submitted was to allow them to make unlimited number of submissions for each exam. So we did that, and the instructions made clear that we would take the last submission that the students made. We also put in place a backup submission form in case students had any difficulties using the Blackboard assignment submission. I'm going to hand over to George now, who will take you through the marking process. Oh, sorry, I need to stop sharing.
Can you hear me now? Right, okay. So now that we've got all these students submitting their work online, it's over to us to do the marking. So the process that we went through was this kind of 3-phase thing where the students had done their submission, so we needed to deal with all those PDFs that had been submitted. Then we needed to send them off for marking, and then we had to think about our moderation process. So I'll step through each of those stages of the process. And as Stephen mentioned, within the marking, we were trying out 3 different tools. So we'll go through those in detail. So starting with the submission, as Stephen said, we've got all these PDFs coming in to Learn. It's quite easy from there to download them all as a zip file. So we downloaded all the attempts because they may have submitted multiple times. And actually what we wanted to take was not their last attempt, but their last on-time attempt, because there was a deadline attached to this. And at this point also the student submissions are not anonymous, so we need to do some processing to make them anonymous files. So what you get from Learn is this zip file, and for each student you've got a receipt text file and you've also got their PDF. And fortunately they're named in a very systematic way. So these numbers here are our kind of non-anonymous student numbers, and we need to turn those into exam numbers. So we took a class list that was prepared by the teaching office, which also noted down any students that were entitled to extra time. This was a kind of wrinkle in the process, that we didn't just have a firm deadline for everyone. Some people were entitled to some extra time. So we needed to go through the logic of all this and take out of this big zip file the correct PDF for each student. So I wrote some code to do that. It's just a little exe file which reads in all the folder and in the spreadsheet, and out of that you get a nice folder where each PDF is named with the student's exam number, which is the more sort of anonymous identifier that we use. So once we've done that, we're ready to do marking. And I should say that the code for doing that, if anyone ever needs to do this for themselves, it's all there on GitHub. I learned the Go programming language to do this and found it quite useful. So you can use that to compile code that will run on different platforms as well. Unfortunately, there was a bit of mopping up to do after this process because not all the students followed the rules. Fortunately, they were quite good at doing that. So I think the guidance that we put in place meant that most students knew what to do and did it correctly. But there were a handful of students who would, maybe in a panic, they weren't able to get the scanning working, but they were able to upload some JPEGs. So we did our best to make those work. They weren't fed through this process automatically, but we had to go through and kind of make a PDF on their behalf and feed it in. And there was also the backup submission form. So this was a Microsoft Forms thing. That was mainly there because we wanted to avoid students panicking if there was some problem with Learn and sending us lots of emails with PDFs and things attached. So we wanted a clear backup route that could be used. And a nice feature of this is that the students had to log in so we know who they were, and it logs all the attempts by time and so on. So I think overall we had 72 submissions to that form, but I think most of them were not actually needed because the students had already made a successful submission to Learn, and it was just them kind of being belt and braces and putting in an extra submission there just in case. But it was useful for a few students, I think, who had some technical problems with accessing Learn. So now we come to actually doing the marking. We had a month in which our exams were taking place from 27th of April to 27th of May. We were using these 3 different tools. So we used RM Assessor for one of our large exams. This is the 3rd year course that almost all our 3rd year students take. I'll come on to talk about RM Assessor in a minute. We also used Gradescope for some of our other larger exams, which were taking place in the middle of the diet. So that's actually 4 different courses, and the 2 with the kind of smaller bars is the same course, but there's different versions of the exam for the undergraduates and the postgraduates taking that course. So those were all courses with large enrollments. And then we're using this 3rd method for the rest of the courses, some of which were large, but most of which were quite small. So overall, there was quite a lot going on there. So that was 2,400 scripts that were being shuffled around. And I am grateful that the university cancelled the exams for 1st and 2nd year, because that would have increased that number massively. So Chris's Introduction to Linear Algebra course, for example, has 700 students. So that would really blow the numbers on this graph out of the water. So going through each of these tools in turn, we did choose to try out different tools here so that we could figure out maybe if we're going to be doing this more longer term, what works well. So we tried RM Assessor, which is a tool that's used by lots of large exam bodies, so the SQA in Scotland and the IB, and I think various A-level exam boards use it as well. So it is quite a robust platform. I'm not quite sure how much of it I meant to show you because of maybe confidentiality agreements and so on, but this is from their website, so you can see it's, as you might expect, you've got the students' work on the left and some tools for assigning marks on the right-hand side. So we signed up with RM to do a proof of concept. So this wasn't their full service where I think we would have a server dedicated to our site. We were actually running on their kind of test server. So it really just was for trying this out with a single course to see if this was going to be a good fit. So the process within RM Assessor works with, you start off with what's called zoning, and that's where you mark up which questions are on which pages. Now, because our first and second year exams were cancelled, we had a lot of PhD students who were expecting to have some marking work to do. So they would normally help us with doing the marking on those large exams. So as Stephen said, we got some help from them to give feedback to students on their submissions in that practice run. We were also able to use some of their time to help with these aspects of getting the marking set up. So they were able to go through and mark up on each script where the different solutions were. And that then makes it much quicker when you come to do the marking, because you can zip through and do all the question 1As if you want to. So during the marking, question 1 was able to be split between 2 of those PhD students. So that was a question where there were 10 subparts where students were to generate an example. And the PhD students were able to quite clearly go off and say, yes, correct. Given a correct example, they've given the justification and just put ticks next to those. The rest of the exam was marked by the lecturer. But because it had already been tagged up as to what parts were on what pages, he was able to go through and mark all the, I missed out question 2 there, actually. So he was marking questions 2 to 4. So he was able to go through and mark all of question 2. And then go through and mark all of question 3. And I think that does speed up the process. And then there's able to be a process of checking. So as the lecturer, he was able to go back and review the marking of the PhD students. Second tool we were using, Gradescope, has a kind of similar feature set. So the idea is, again, that you can split the marking up by question. It also adds in the feature of having rubrics by which you do the marking. So I'll talk about each of those in turn. We had a slight problem with the splitting up exams because we're kind of fitting into the way that Gradescope is set up. Doesn't quite fit with our process. So they're imagining 2 different workflows. One is an exam where you know exactly where each of the answers is. So in the example that's on screen there from the Gradescope website, you know that the answer to question 1 is going to be roughly in that place where the green box is, because you've got a template for the exam that the students are writing on. So we're not exactly in that situation. And on the right is where the students themselves upload their work and they do the process of saying question 1 is on this page, question 2 is on that page. So we're kind of somewhere in between those, unfortunately, because we didn't want to have students going directly to Gradescope to upload their work. We wanted to make sure that they all had a consistent upload process. So it really needed to be us that was doing the uploading. So this was a bit of a thing to think about. Fortunately, one of my colleagues was able to kind of solve this process where we were able to do the uploading kind of manually on the student's behalf. So Colin Rundell, one of my colleagues, was able to automate this using R. So essentially just using the Gradescope website to upload each PDF in turn, but you just set off R to do that automatically. And then still we needed to go through and mark up which questions were on which pages. So again, we were able to use some PhD student time to help with that. The marking itself, it works with rubrics, and I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. So the general process that we used was that the lecturer, the course organizer for the course, developed that rubric, and then the marking team, which in some cases was maybe just 1 or 2 people, but in others, we had quite a few PhD students working on it. They were able to go through and just apply that rubric for a given question. And then all the data is there, so the lecturer can go back and review the marking as well. So here's what Gradescope looks like. When you're doing the zoning, on the left, you've got the breakdown of questions by part. So if you were to click on to 2B, you're then able to click on to which pages have the answer to 2B on it. So that when the person's coming through to mark part 2B, they'll see all and only the relevant pages. When you're actually in the marking interface, so this is what, I'm not really able to show you our student work. I think it would be a bit unfair when we've not already released the marks to them to be showing it to other people. So this is just from Gradescope. So you've got the work on the left, and then on the right-hand side, the rubric that you're applying. So you can select as many of these items as apply. And you have a helpful overview of how the progress is going for each of the question parts as well. So one thing that was a bit of a thing we had to worry about, so it's not kind of the way that we normally do marking, is that the default setting here is to use negative marking with the rubrics. And we decided to go with that because I guess it's the default for a reason. And it does, I think, make a lot of sense to identify the error that's been made and give feedback on that error. So I think it means that at the end of this, although we're not trying to make the exams give useful feedback necessarily, the students will at least know where the mistake was if they were losing marks. So we were able to develop that rubric, and a nice thing with it is that you can tweak it as you go. So if it turns out that you've been overly harsh in taking off marks for one of these items, you can just type on this and change the mark allocation. So maybe we've been taking off 2 for that, and we've decided that's too harsh. I want to change it and make it -1. And that will apply retrospectively across all the items that have been tagged with that. You then, at the end of the process, get very helpful overview statistics. So we can see that 50% of the students were making this mistake. So that's kind of useful information for later teaching. Overall, I would say the feedback that we had from colleagues using this was very positive, and they found the rubrics quite easy to use once they got up and running. And certainly when they were doing the marking, they found it very fast. So we'd put in we kind of paid the cost of marking up the pages as to where each question was. But once that was done, it meant that the marking process does get very quick. And Gradescope themselves have done some research on this, and they seem to think that the marking gets kind of quicker over time. So as you get more used to the rubric, the amount of time that you spend on each script reduces as you mark more and more scripts. The third tool that we were using for most of the exams was very low tech. So this was just taking the PDFs that the students submitted and essentially getting colleagues to do their marking on those PDFs. The way that we did this was by adding forms to the PDFs. So and then we were able to extract those marks from forms.
We're having a bit of trouble with your microphone, George.
So I can get the microphone. That's okay.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, that's much better.
Good. Sorry about that. I think when my laptop gets overexcited, the fan noise is not so good. Okay, so the idea here is that we're then able to read all the marks out into a spreadsheet nice and easily. So this is what the process looked like, designed by a colleague in our School of Engineering, Tim Drysdale. So he rapidly set about developing this, and that was kind of why I got into writing Go, because that was his programming language of choice. So on the right, you'll see the process that he was mapping out in engineering, but actually the process in maths was going to be slightly different. So I forked that project and made some changes to kind of suit our own process. So what our process looked like, we took the students' PDFs, ran it through this overlay script, which adds on the forms, and the output looks something like this. So down the right-hand side, we get a set of forms that we can then type in the marks. So just showing you in a bit more detail. So we needed to feed in for each of the papers exactly what the parts and marks breakdown was, and then that gives you a box just to type in the number of marks. So as a marker, you can go through with various PDF editing tools. So here is just an example of me using a sticky note to add a comment. We did also add, you can see the column of blue boxes. So those are form fields as well, where you can type in little notes if you're not able to leave sticky notes. Also, if you're using an iPad or another device with pen input, you can annotate the PDFs freely as well. And as I mentioned, we're able to then read out the marks that are typed into the form fields using a check marking code, which produces a spreadsheet. And this quite helpfully shows you the means for each part as you go, and also flags up various validation issues, like if you've typed in 5 marks out of 4 by mistake, or maybe you've allocated marks to a part on 2 different pages. It will flag up those sort of things for you to go back and review. And then at the end of the process, we take the PDFs and flatten them down so that any comments that you've left as sticky notes will be turned into footnotes, so that they can't then be edited. So that's when it goes off to the exam board at that point. We were using SharePoint to do moving around of all the files, and I think that worked quite well for us. Colleagues who were marking on iPad found that using the OneDrive app, it was very smooth for them to go from one PDF to the next. What I would say if you were doing this sort of approach is to test your PDF viewer, because they don't all support Acrobat forms. And I was kind of terrified that we'd have a colleague who would go off and do all their marking and realize that we couldn't read out the marks. Fortunately, that didn't happen. So just kind of testing it out as you've done a few scripts will seem to be the way that we avoided that problem. The moderation process, I think the feedback that we've had on that is that colleagues enjoyed not having to do the adding up for themselves. So that definitely saved a lot of time that was not really usefully used on academics doing arithmetic. And at the exam board, I think the process went quite well. They found having those mark spreadsheets readily available was very helpful, and being able to electronically locate the borderline scripts that they needed to give special consideration, that was useful too. As to where we're going next with this, it's still a bit early to say definitively, but I think it is going to be growing in need. So we're going to be doing our remote exams in December again, if colleagues are still wanting to use exams in their courses. And I guess that will include all of the first and second year courses with large enrollments. So there's only going to be more stuff to be marking in this way. There may also be more use of midterms and other large in-course assessments. And we've also got the issue to think about of we tend to have weekly or fortnightly written work that's handed in. And so similar processes would be useful there, I think. Some issues that are in my head that we need to address in all this, obviously the way that we were doing the zoning, marking out which questions are on which page, was unsustainable to be paying PhD students to do that. So I think that's something that we will need to devolve to students in one way or another. So Gradescope, the students maybe would be uploading it themselves and marking up the questions for themselves. Or maybe this idea of mixing in stack questions with upload your working for question 4 here, which Chris has set up a demo of, which I think you can all access through the EAMS site. And we need to think about how we streamline this process of collecting submissions, dealing with late work and so on. And finally, making the process kind of smooth from the markers end. So I think Gradescope is quite a usable tool, actually. How can we replicate that in other tools if we're not going with Gradescope? And that's me.
Thanks, George. Thanks very much. So questions, please. If you have them for George and Stephen, let's have a quick look at the... So while colleagues type their questions in, Stephen, George...
I think Stephen's had to leave, unfortunately.
All right, so George then, which would you recommend? I mean, running 3 in parallel looks, you know, I mean, it was an experiment, wasn't it? We weren't sure which one. So which one should we go for in future, and why?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I've not fully thought through all the implications of all the different options, to be honest. Probably Gradescope is the front runner in my head in terms of the features that it has. But there are issues around how it integrates with other tools that we might be using. So I kind of see the merit of having it maybe sitting alongside our stack assessments that the students are used to doing during the course. But then it comes to, is it going to be as usable for markers? So, you know, maybe there are some things that we can be doing to make the marking process in the middle quiz a more kind of usable experience. I think that would be the kind of best of both worlds in my mind.
Yeah, and it sounded a little bit like the handling of the PDFs was on a wing and a prayer, really. I mean, it worked well, but that's not, you know, you talked about not sustainable and having PhDs zoning.
Yeah.
But we also, I think, would probably want to tighten up and automate some of those intermediate processes of handling files.
Yes, there was a lot of effort had to go into that, and I should also thank our colleague Carlos Abata-Caratala, who was doing a lot of the exam processing for us as well.
I mean, once that exam number is on a student script, you want to be absolutely sure that really is the right student script, don't you?
Yeah.
Good. So thank you, Debbie, for posting a question. Okay, there's more of a comment than a question. So there's a comment there about Gradescope. Students can zone on their own. Rubrics can be positive or negative, and so on. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you, George. Thank you, Stephen, for presenting what you've done there. I mean, that was a lot of work to do 3 things in an emergency. And thank you for showing the options and the relative merits of that.